Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Rising Laterally podcast. This is Arjun Sachdev.
And this is Jay Ballou. We hope you find something here that offers you new meaning or a fresh perspective.
If you do, we encourage you to give it life.
Be bold.
Experiment.
And most importantly, bring it into the interactions with the people you surround yourself with.
And see what happens. Our guest today is Dr. Mirei Claremon, who is a behavioral scientist, cross-cultural consumer insights expert, wife, and relatively new mom based in LA. She's been studying how we act and make choices and is now working hard not only to help raise a family, but also bridge the gap between academia, business, the East and West in terms of the cultures. And all of this is designed to create more balance across people and the planet. She's teaching in the sustainability program at UCLA and is currently working on a book that introduces the concept of behavioral sustainability. If you have not noticed this as a trend, all you have to do is reflect on the Super Bowl this year. If you notice the commercials, there was a huge emphasis on electric vehicles and the environment. And if you look outside of that example, if you consider the companies that you interact with on a daily basis, many of them are now hyper-focused on the increased diversity and increasing wages. So knowing sustainability and how it impacts all parts of our life is a critical part of your future. The implications are huge. There's still gaps that exist, and it's a very dynamic topic. So Dr. Claremon, welcome to the show, and thanks for being here to help break this down for us.
Thank you, Arjun. Thank you, Jay. It's really great to be here. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Excited to have you here. Yep.
And so for orientation, let's start with your background. Your dissertation on cross-cultural differences in branding and loyalty, included some fascinating findings that are worth sharing. So tell us a little bit about that research, what you found, and then how that led to landing on the framework that you want to, share in your new book.
Sure. Yeah. So first of all, I'm originally from Tokyo, Japan. So I've always had like a cross-cultural lens. Even though I grew up in Japan, I went to international school basically my whole childhood from preschool to high school. And so I've always been surrounded by people from different cultures, speaking different languages with different customs and values. So I've always really been fascinated by people and their differences in behaviors and of course commonalities too. And so, in college, I studied psychology and I didn't really know what I was going to do after. But when I started thinking about marketing and consumers and how all these global businesses are doing different things in and around the world, it was really fascinating to me. And of course, coming from the psychology side, I have been focusing on the consumer behavior differences. And so in my dissertation, I focused on what does self-expression mean in terms of consumption. And the conventional wisdom is that Asian consumers don't usually self-express. They're conformist and they always choose the safe choice. And that's why they like big brands like Coca-Cola or Louis Vuitton, which if you've ever been to Asia, is actually not very true at all. If you notice, a lot of people have very original styles. They kind of mix and match different brands. And there are always new launches and limited edition designs in Japan. And so why is that? So even if they're consuming the same brands as Americans, for example, so let's take Coca-Cola. Okay. If an American buys Coca-Cola and a Japanese person buys Coca-Cola, is it because of the same reason? That's the question that I really wanted to answer. And there are huge implications of that, right? Because if they're not buying it for the same reasons, then the marketing should be different. The communication should be different. The kinds of products that are launched should be different. And so there are huge business implications here that are really not understood at all. And that's why, companies like Coca-Cola who actually understand this do something really different in Asia versus in the US. So in the US, consumers want their Coca-Cola to be just Coca-Cola. They don't want frills. They don't want changes. And if you recall, there was a huge fiasco when they tried to change the recipe of Coke and all the loyalists got really angry. The opposite is true in Asia. If you don't change your product, if you don't keep innovating in doing something new and exciting, people will move away because brands are not part of your inner identity to the same degree as it is for Americans. So for Americans, if you're a Coca-Cola person, you're never going to buy Pepsi, right? It's the same thing with sports teams, right? And that kind of self-expression. So the self-expression for Americans through consumption is, this is my brand, this is my identity. I'm a Coca-Cola guy. That's why I drink this. And so don't change my product because this is who I am. Because this is my identity. Don't change
violating
it.
my identity. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in Asia, it's more contextual. So of course there are preferences, but it's also about whether you're drinking the Coke with your boss. And maybe if he wants to, get a round of Pepsi for everybody, it's fine. It's really not a big deal. Or sometimes you want to drink green tea, and so you pick green tea, right? And so when people want to choose products in Japan, which is where most of the innovation happens, and then it kind of trickles into other markets in Asia and around the world too, they have limited edition products. So Kit Kat is a great example because there are so many flavors, and people who have been to Japan, I think, almost always notice this. There's like cherry blossom flavors during the spring. There's soy sauce. There's uni. There's green tea. There's everything. And this happens constantly. And this doesn't just go for consumer products, consumer packaged goods. It also happens for Louis Vuitton. So they always want to do something exciting, limited edition. So again, like cherry blossom design bags, for example. Wow. And so is that really about conformist? Is this really consistent with being conformist?
It sounds like no.
Not necessarily, right? And so in terms of brand loyalty, it's actually counterintuitive because Americans think Asians are more brand loyal because they think they're more conformist and always choose the same brands. But Americans are actually more brand loyal if you look at it this way, because they don't want to change. They don't think it's a good thing to always be changing brands. And of course, the younger generation is different, but this is kind of a theme that actually runs through and is relevant in the sustainability realm too. So, it's ultimately about what drives people's behaviors, and that is rooted in what is considered good in each society. And so what is considered good in terms of who you are as a person is different depending on the cultural background and the context.
Absolutely. No, that's fascinating. And I know when it comes to sustainability itself, like the cultural differences in mindset is huge. And we're going to talk about that. But before we get there, let's actually table set a little bit because sustainability is something that if you ask 10 people, they'll know that the word exists, but they might give you 10 different answers. And so there's always this conventional wisdom around buzzwords, but because of that difference, how about we ask you to just define some of the buzzwords within sustainability, whether that's sustainability itself, whether that's ESG, whether it's environmental racism. Like these are terms that we're going to be using throughout the rest of the conversation. So let's define them now, and then we'll know what you mean as you refer to them in the rest of the episode.
Sure. Yeah, so definitions are very, very important, but I think are underappreciated. And so in the marketplace today, sustainability is just greenwashed. So that's one term that we need to think about. Greenwashed. So greenwashing is when companies pretend like they're doing something that's sustainable or eco-friendly when they're actually just paying lip service. There's an analogy that some people call Black Lives Matter washing, right? Where it's companies are pretending to be anti-racist and are putting, a Black person as their PR person, or saying that they're contributing some portion of their revenues to Black Lives Matter initiatives when they're actually not really doing anything internally to change that systemic racism. And so this happens a lot and is a huge issue, especially if consumers don't have time, which most of them don't, to really do the research and dig into what companies are actually doing, what they're saying they're doing. So that's one. And then I think...
Sorry, can I ask a quick question there? Given the fact that these terms are emerging, do you think there are people that are becoming more skeptical of those kind of surface level gestures, or is it still really only something that's observed in small circles at this point?
I think it's a good question. I think within the more sustainably active, if you will, consumers, there is more awareness of this. But I think in general, people still don't understand. And even if you understand that this exists, the reality is when you go to the supermarket, how much time are you going to actually spend to do research on the spot when you're buying detergent?
Right.
So it really depends on, maybe if you're buying a car, it's a different story because you are more inclined to do research. But if it's consumer packaged goods that's, not really going to make a difference in your life, then you're just going to snatch up what catches your eye.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah.
So the other term that I think is one of the most important things that people need to understand is intersectionality, and which is basically the interconnectedness between the different social sustainability issues. And so maybe we should define what sustainability is. Right. So the most common definition is this pertains to sustainable development. So developing and making sure that we are meeting the needs of the present without sacrificing the needs of the future. And so that's kind of the basic idea of sustainability. But when people think about sustainability, most often people only think about environmental causes and environmental issues. So like, polar bears being endangered, or the rainforests burning or being cut down.
Or the carbon footprint.
Or the carbon footprint, and climate change. But what I think is the most important part that's missing is the social aspect, the human aspect. And really, that's why I got interested in this field. It's not necessarily because I care about rainforests or polar bears, because that's how a lot of people get into environmentalism and sustainability. But for me, being a psychologist, I was interested in the human behaviors and also the human sacrifices that we have been making as a society because of economic interests. And so the interconnectedness between environmental issues and social issues are still really not understood, and the economic issues, right? So the three pillars of sustainability are economic, environmental, and social. So people, planet, and profit. Some people like to say prosperity, which is, I think, a better term than profit. Yeah. But it's supposed to be a balance between these different pillars, which is clearly not being achieved. And so this is why there needs to be a balance and a more holistic view of sustainability, which is what I argue in my book. And so behavioral sustainability is the term that I want to use. And I think of it as a movement that is more inclusive and more diverse and incorporates research insights from behavioral science and from other cultures and history and nature.
And really makes the emphasis on a person, not necessarily a company or a country. It's really about the person at that point.
Yeah, it's really focused on people, whether it's the focus on like people's behaviors or the effect that these issues have on people. Because at the end of the day, the planet will be here, even if we're not here for a while, right? And so when some people talk about saving the planet, really what they mean is saving the planet so that we can live on it, so that it's livable for us as human beings.
Yeah, so that definitely requires a more holistic approach to this scenario as opposed to how some might have been approaching it from an individual perspective, like, oh, it's not really affecting me, I shouldn't really think about it from a collective standpoint. So when you actually talk about balancing people, planet, and prosperity, that really actually now creates a situation where it's much more inclusive and collective. And so you may not right now, if you're listening, you may be overconfident in your own views on this topic. But if you kind of start to look at the world and be like, look, I don't control a lot of this stuff, then you kind of break all those barriers and can be more inclusive. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the biggest barrier we have in terms of human behavior is this lack of awareness and understanding that these issues are all connected and it's all going to affect us. Not just the poor people, not just the people who live on the other side of the world, but everybody. And so, it's like Al Gore said, it's an inconvenient truth, and most people just don't want to think about it and deal with it. But if we don't, then that cost is going to be even bigger than if we invest resources to do something about it today.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the issues that I've been thinking about a lot is, we talk too much about metrics and numbers and quantifiable goals. Or maybe I shouldn't say we talk too much about it, but we overemphasize them, and we don't really talk about how we can actually engage people and have a conversation with people, not just at the policy level or at the business leader level, but on a, like you and me.
Right.
Like, how do we talk about it? How do you make it relevant to everyday people? And if we just talk about, we have to curb emissions by X% by this year, it doesn't mean anything, right?
Right.
For someone who lives in Texas. So how do we make it relevant to people? And also, and to do that, you have to connect the dots. So for example, when we talk about plastic pollution, most people only think about plastic that's floating in the ocean. So a lot of people know about the garbage patch and microplastics these days.
Right.
But we don't talk about how it affects poor communities where they live next to a fossil fuel plant, right? And I mean, I think a lot of people still don't understand that plastics are made from fossil fuels. So that's a huge problem. And then the cradle to grave journey that plastic takes. So after it's consumed, it goes to the landfill or recycling. Well, it's not really recycled much, but most of it goes to a landfill. Where are those landfills? Again, they're built in vulnerable communities. Or they're shipped overseas to poorer countries.
Right.
So it's literally this NIMBY idea of, well, I want to consume plastic, but I don't want to see it. So let's just ship it off to somewhere we can't see it. And so like in the Philippines, for example, there are these very poor communities where they literally live on top of these landfills.
It's wild.
And we don't see it, right? And so we don't talk about plastic as a social issue, but we need to talk about it as a social issue. And this is why environmental and social aspects of sustainability come into interaction, is because these people, the poorer people, disproportionately always get affected by the environmental issues, and therefore it becomes a social issue. And it affects their health, it affects their mental development, it affects their stress levels, and it affects the entire trajectory of their lives.
And what's the best way to message to people about these social issues in a way that will make them care about issues that are presently sort of out of sight, out of mind? I heard you mention in one of the podcasts I listened to that the way you might message to liberal voters on a social issue will differ from the way you message to conservative voters. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So as we know, this country is very polarized currently, and sadly, like climate change and sustainability have become a politically divisive issue, which is unfortunate because interestingly, in the past, and not so long ago, conservatives actually were environmentalists. Like they actually cared about the environment, and that's not crazy if you think about what they like to do. They like to go hunting. They like to go fishing. They like nature. They like the outdoors. So of course they should care about the environment. Also, going into religion, if the idea is to protect God's creation, which is how research shows that if it's framed that way, then conservatives say, yes, I care about the environment and I care about environmental issues, right? Versus how most liberals and people in the sustainability movement talk about environmental issues is not that way. They talk about fairness and care for victims and people who are oppressed. And that language just doesn't resonate across the aisle. So part of it is understanding what kind of language you should use to communicate if the ultimate objective is to change the other side's mind.
Right, yeah.
And so I think oftentimes people get too caught up in like being right and being wrong, and then this being a zero-sum game, which goes into, the issues with analytic thinking, because it leads to this myopic perspective on, having this dichotomous notion that like, if I'm right, then you're wrong. This is the only way we should think about environmental issues is about fairness and care, where it actually doesn't matter, right?
Right.
The outcome is what matters. So if you want people to care, then let's think about how can we achieve that outcome.
It's interesting because you've written in the past around like how that creates such a formal way of thinking, such a linear way of thinking, and that's not very helpful when all we're trying to do is find like this one single truth. Like when something is so dynamic as this topic, having this type of analytical style of thinking may work against you.
Yes. So I wrote about this cross-cultural framework which is a cognitive framework of analytic versus holistic thinking. And analytic thinking originates in ancient Greece. And it's tied to this stronger notion of individualism and an independent view of the self. So thinking that each and every person is separate and autonomous and is consistent across time and contexts. So that kind of idea of people and individuals leads to this idea that there's only one linear way of thinking. So either I'm right or you're wrong. Their contradictions are uncomfortable and cannot be true. Versus the Eastern way of thinking, which originates in ancient China, is more holistic. And the idea is that change is always happening. That is the only constant, and therefore things are unpredictable, and so therefore nothing is linear, and contradictions are normal and natural because everything's always changing, right?
And we're different. You're different. I'm different. Jay's different. The listener's different. We're all different. So we're going to have differences.
Exactly. So context is really, really important in that holistic way of thinking. Because nothing in the real world can be decontextualized. So analytic thinking can be really good when you have like a specific math equation or a scientific equation that you want to solve, right? Or if you land on something that you need to drill down and understand and dissect and look under a microscope, analytic thinking is very useful, and holistic thinking is not necessarily useful. But when you're looking at issues like sustainability, which is very complicated and broad and involves human interactions, you can't just use analytic thinking. So what I'm proposing is you need to combine the two and use both, because we need technological solutions. But I argue that you can create better technological solutions if you understand the context. Like, why is this important in the larger context of climate change or sustainability? If you understand that, then you can do a better job of thinking about how to solve a problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of messaging, a real quick question, like, who do you think bears the responsibility of this? Like, who should be out there right now talking about this in the context of what everyone is dealing with on a daily basis? Like, everyone is concerned about being able to like collect a $1,400 stimulus check right now. Yeah. How should we really get them to start to think about this, and who should be responsible for it? This podcast is going to help, but what is something else that people can be doing?
Well, it depends on who you are, right? So there's a really interesting movement called effective altruism. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Peter Singer, I think, was one
Yeah,
of them.
yes, exactly. The idea is basically, given who you are, how can you make the biggest impact? That's kind of how you, so it's like, what is the ROI on what you're doing? And I think that's a really important way to think about it, because maybe if you're, an investment banker who works at Goldman Sachs, the best use of your time is not to volunteer at a soup kitchen and, give soup to the homeless. Maybe you need to earn a lot more money by going to the office for a few more hours and then use that money to invest in building infrastructure for homeless shelters, for example. Mm-hmm. And so it depends on who you are and what your resources are and what your skill set is. Of course, policymakers need to be really incorporating insights and research from behavioral science to really think about what kinds of policies make sense. For example, and the criminal justice system is still very outdated. It doesn't really incorporate any insights about, human mental illness, for example, and chemical imbalances in the brain that can inhibit people's ability to control their behavior. But that kind of evidence is never used in court to help someone who may have committed a crime, right? But had these mental issues. And so if we think about what is the point of the prison system, like in Norway, they have a rehabilitative initiative. So they think the point of the prison system is to help these incarcerated individuals, of course, pay for their crime, but also integrate them back into society. Because if they don't, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help their families. It doesn't help the community. It doesn't help the government, because it's expensive to keep somebody in prison and they're not productive members of society.
Right.
But that's definitely not the way that the US prison system works currently.
It seems like that would be a more holistic approach to rehabilitation in the context of prisoners and reentry into the normal world. I'm wondering how certain parts of the West started to embrace that more holistic view of at least that problem, whereas other places like the US maybe are still thinking about social issues like that in a much more narrowly analytical way. So it seems like there was some perhaps influence from the East that penetrated part of the West, but not all of it. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts there.
The analytic holistic framework is just one framework. So I don't feel comfortable saying like this is just an Eastern way of thinking. But I think what we can say is that the U.S. has become so much more extreme in its individualism and independent view of the self. Because if you think about even a few decades ago, like Robert Putnam from Harvard, he wrote an article called "Bowling Alone," which a lot of people read, essentially about civic engagement declining and moral capital declining in the US. And his argument was that people are moving away to cities, they're, separating from families and are really going about their own life without really engaging in community activities. And that's a problem. And of course, now there's social media where the younger generation and the older generation too spend so much time online by themselves and just severed from the rest of the world. And, the Gen Z, they just don't spend as much time with their friends as the older generations used to. They don't go to the mall as much.
Yeah.
They don't date as much. They don't drive. They don't have sex. It's really, and so they are taking longer to grow up. And, they're being coddled in many ways. And that's an article that was published in the Atlantic about why the younger generation are perceived to be so much more fragile. And that's why we can't have real difficult conversations. And campuses are having to cancel speakers who may, quote unquote, trigger people and their sensitivities.
Yeah.
And so they're graduating from college not being prepared for the real world where these kinds of conflicts and discomforts are inevitably going to happen, right? So we're not really helping the younger generation by protecting them too much.
It's so funny because it's like instead of exposing kids or young adults, we already frame that they shouldn't be listening to it. So we just continue to put our own biases in their minds. It's like, no, this is going to trigger you. Don't even look that way. And it's like, no, you have to expose them.
Well, so the interesting analogy is with the peanut allergy, right? So there has been an explosion of people with peanut allergies in the US and other allergies. And it's because at one point, doctors decided, oh my God, like kids have peanut allergies. And so let's not expose them. So the guideline was to not expose kids to peanuts. And that exacerbated the problem. And now they're saying, actually, wait a minute, we should expose them just little by little. And so it's that idea. It's the same with vaccines too. We have to expose them a little so that they can build up their immunity.
Yeah. Now we're allergic to having difficult conversations.
Exactly. And Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, exactly.
And Dr. Seuss, exactly. That's funny. But earlier in our conversation, you had mentioned the word metrics. I want to go back to that because there's something around like metrics versus like the spirit of what you're doing. And so maybe something that we can do is learn from some of the oldest companies in the world. I know you and I were talking off air about this, but if you look at Japanese and European companies, there are 10 to 15 of them that have been around for 500, 600 years. So maybe there's something or more. Yeah. So maybe there's something interesting about these old companies that have been around for a long time that we can learn from as it relates to sustainability and being able to survive in the future as well. Can you expand on that for us a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So the oldest business in the world is from the 500s. So it's been around for almost 1,500 years.
There you go. I'm not good at public math.
Oh, it's okay. They're so old. It's incredible. And then the next four are also Japanese and have been around since the 700s. Right. Wow. So I think when I saw this and I learned about this, it really made me think maybe we need to expand on the definition of sustainability. Right. Because I think it's safe to argue that if they've been around for that long, they are sustainable businesses.
Yeah.
They have sustained themselves over hundreds and hundreds of years. Right. So I started thinking into like, why is that? Like, who are these companies and what do they do right? And what can we learn from them? And so the oldest is a construction company. And then I think the next four are all hotels. And so it's really interesting. And then I think there are I can't remember the data, but there are so many old businesses in Japan, like even beyond these top 5. So there's something to say there. And a lot of it has to do with human connection.
Yeah.
So it comes back to that, right? And so, for example, the Ise Shrine, which is not the oldest, but they've been around since the 7th century. So it's the most respected Shinto shrine in Japan. So Shintoism is a native Japanese religion. I think it's pretty similar in terms of its belief in spirits, that everything has a spirit. So the belief in animism to Native American beliefs. And it's oneness with nature. So people are considered to be part of nature. There's no God, like the Christian God. Yeah. And the kami are really not gods. They're more like spirits. So like the rock has a spirit, the waterfall has a spirit, the mountain has a spirit. And so it really is still it's still very ingrained in Japanese people's psyche.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Zen Buddhism. So Japanese people are interesting because we have a mishmash of beliefs and ideas. Yeah. And I think it works, right? Because it's really about incorporating new things in a way that it doesn't conflict it with anything. So it's more about how do you adapt new ideas and incorporate it. That's really the way that Japan has always been.
That should be the definition of sustainability. That right there, just your ability to pivot and what's going on in the macro world without losing focus of that connection to your human client. So when you look at the oldest companies, they're hotels, restaurants, pubs, breweries, and wine companies. So to your point, they all deal with people. So if that's your core, your ability to navigate and pivot around what's going on in the macro makes you sustainable.
Yeah, and I think, kind of going into religion, monotheism tends to be exclusionary, right? You either believe in it or you don't. But Asian religions are more like philosophies, and they're more like guiding principles. So you don't have to believe in it or not. It's more like using it as kind of a guideline. And so, it's not exclusionary.
Yeah.
And like, especially in Japan, like you can, like people go to Shinto shrines for New Year's. You do Buddhist funerals. We eat Christmas cake. I mean, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
It's really more about spirituality than religiosity. And so, like the Ise Shrine example is really interesting, and I think is a perfect way to think about sustainability, because it's rebuilt every 20 years. And the reason is, one, because, buildings don't last forever. It's not made of concrete. So it has to be rebuilt, but they break it down and then they send the different pieces of wood to different parts of Japan. And because Ise Shrine is so respected, people like the other shrines want this wood, and they can say, this wood came from Ise Shrine. So it's reused and repurposed. And the second reason why they're rebuilt every 20 years is so that you can pass on the knowledge of how to build and rebuild to the next generation.
Nice.
And so they purposely rebuild it before it needs to be rebuilt so that they can pass on the knowledge. And so I think, to me, that spirit of human connection and passing something on directly to the next generation creates this mentality of really respecting not just the building, but people and your ancestors and their wisdom. And I think that's really kind of what's missing from the current Western framework of sustainability, is the spirit or the mindset of sustainability. And I think people are starting to pay attention to the Native Americans and how they talk about nature and their relationship with nature, which I think is, in some ways similar to the Shinto way of thinking about nature.
Yeah. And a couple interesting points there. Going back to your point that there's an inclusive philosophy here baked into Shintoism. Like, there's nothing controversial about saying that humans are of nature and like we're connected with the universe and we're made up of the universe. And I think, so number one, that's a great kind of philosophy because it's completely consistent with everything we know about science. And number two, I think it makes it easier to care about things beyond yourself. If you see yourself as this little sort of atomized unit, like moving through reality, discrete from reality, not made up of the universe, but something, separate from it, it's just a much larger gulf to cross to get you to care about anything beyond yourself,
Yeah, and I think that's why the relationship between religion and atheism in this country is interesting. And it's another way that this country is polarized, right?
Yeah.
Like evangelicals and then like hardcore atheists. And I think it's interesting. I keep seeing over and over that people who go to college and become woke, become hardcore atheists, right? They just believe in science. They think anybody who believes in religion is silly or foolish or they don't really understand how the world works. But if you think about how science started, the history of science, modern Western science, it started with trying to understand God's creation better, like understanding nature better for religious reasons. And so I think, we need to go back to that kind of connection that people felt with nature. Um, we don't like science and religion doesn't have to be dichotomous, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. And I think that kind of mentality is toxic, and it creates unnecessary conflict between people. And so, again, it's like, what is the ultimate objective? Is it to prove the other person wrong? Or is it to work together and collaborate together so we can build a better future? And so I think religion can be a force for good too. It's just how do we interpret it? How do we think about it? And then how do we combine it with science?
Absolutely.
And then how do we navigate religion, Black Lives Matter, cancel culture, the fact that people don't think this is a win-win game? I mean, this is a super interesting conversation to be having. And I just feel like we can be talking about this forever.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Because it's like always going to be changing, and there's always going to be different opinions. And I'm just trying to figure out, like, how do we get that uniform playing field where everyone can actually be on board? And I think one way that's happening is on the investor side of the equation, right? If you look at like behavioral sustain or ESG, a lot more investors are actually making statements with their money. So sustainable investing has actually reached an all-time highs, not only in terms of dollar amounts, but it also tends to outperform just the general market. But just to give you some insight, in 2020, sustainable funds took in over $50 billion in new investments, which was more than double the previous record that was set in 2019. And then add to that, these companies that have these sustainable ratings, they tend to outperform a company that doesn't. So I think one way people are trying to make a statement is with their money right now.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the rise of stakeholder capitalism over shareholder capitalism is huge, right? And as you guys know, like BlackRock has been leading the way and saying, if you don't divest in dirty companies and focus on being more sustainable, people are not going to invest. And same with consumers. Consumers have become more and more demanding in terms of transparency of supply chain, sourcing, and everything from animal rights to human rights. But then I think it's still sustainability is still a privilege, which is unfortunate. But at the end of the day, going back to this idea of scarcity, people don't have the time or the money. A lot of people don't, to make more sustainable choices. They are forced to stay in this world where they don't have any choice, and they're barely making it every day. And these are the people who have been the most affected by the pandemic, by the climate crisis, by these environmental and social injustices. And so if we can't include them to be part of the movement, then how can we even demand them to make more sustainable choices? Because a lot of people say, we should go meatless, or we shouldn't use plastic, or we shouldn't buy single-use water bottles. But the reality is, a lot of the poor people, the vulnerable communities in the US and overseas, they don't have a choice. They can't buy a $20 water bottle that's made of glass or stainless steel. And so, we need to break this cycle so that they can be part of the solution, because of course they want to be. They don't want to live next to a fossil fuel plant.
Yeah.
They don't want to live on a pile of trash.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting that, I think a lot of people maybe that are in privileged positions in society like to kind of keep score about how good of a job they're doing, but really like the game they're playing might only be relevant in the context of their peers. And were they to expect someone that was several, rungs down the socioeconomic ladder to care about the little ways they're tweaking their lifestyle, that would be kind of a ludicrous thing to expect of someone that has, bigger fish to fry, it seems.
Yeah, and I think it is dangerous to put too much onus on how much individual actions can make an impact in terms of climate change, because the reality is it really doesn't. What we really need to focus on is making sure that we shut down all the fossil fuel plants. But we can't just do that, right? So how do we transition to clean energy? Like, how do we get people off of plastics? And again, so much of it is about awareness, because if more people knew that plastic bottles are made of fossil fuels, I would hope that they would think about it differently. But if people don't know about it, then nothing's going to change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think just to keep going a little bit on like the good side of what's going on in sustainability, we talked about people making a statement with their money, but also companies are trying to pay more. They're trying to emphasize more like, mental health in the workplace. I think those are forms of sustainability as well. They're trying to be more inclusive, but as you said, there's one thing of talking about it. There's another thing about doing it. You mentioned BlackRock. I mean, BlackRock is sending out letters to CEOs telling them that if they don't take climate change seriously, or if they don't start to incorporate this, BlackRock's putting a lot of pressure on a lot of companies to do it. When you look at their own headlines, they're also having issues with inclusion and diversity. So even the biggest asset manager in the world is balancing these two of actually having metrics and spirit match up.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky thing because now there's so much soundbite activism and knee-jerk responses. And social media just makes it so easy to just criticize someone or cancel someone because of one thing they did or said. And it doesn't even have to be today. It could have been 15 years ago. And it's just that kind of response and stance that people have today about like seeing the worst in people versus giving people the benefit of the doubt or giving people a second chance is, it's really not going to help us solve these bigger issues because it's a time suck. A lot of what's going on, like the Twitter wars and things like that, is a time suck and an opportunity cost that we can, like that energy, we can be using for something so much more important.
How much time do you think about social media? I mean, is the project here getting people off social media or getting people to use it in a different way?
I think it's more for me, how do we help people become better critical thinkers and just become more thoughtful and empathetic when it comes to responding to people who may not necessarily be part of their own circle. Because at the end of the day, like technology is a tool and it can be used for good or bad depending on who you are. And so what the fundamental issue is people and how to build trust between people and how to build compassion. And, it is true that people spending too much time on social media is basically taking time away that they could be spending with their family or reading a novel, because we know that when people read fiction, they become more empathetic. They cultivate more an ability to understand other people's perspectives. But reading a tweet or seeing an Instagram post does not do that.
Yeah.
So, how do we create more opportunities for people to actually engage with people, especially outside of their bubble?
Yeah, and turn the happiness of this country around too. I mean, a question that has come up in the past is how can a nation be sustainable if the people that are living in it are unhappy?
I don't think you can. You have to, subjective well-being is so important. And I think, we talked about this offline, I think, about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And it doesn't really include much about subjective well-being. And, again, it is harder to measure. It's harder to quantify, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. There are other countries like Bhutan who have come up with, a different way of measuring happiness. And, people may not agree with it exactly, but it doesn't have to be GDP, because GDP certainly does not measure happiness. Especially if you're already a developed country, I think if anything in the US, there's probably an inverse correlation, right?
Yeah.
Because it's so not evenly distributed that it's actually increasing the unhappiness of not just the people who don't have the resources, but even the top 1%, because it creates a sense of distrust and anxiety within the entire country. And so there is research that shows that extreme inequality is bad for everybody, not just the bottom, but the top too. And so, it is, again, about figuring out how we can engage communities. And people make fun of local communities and local government and local politics and local newspapers. But that's really, I think the more I do research about this, the more I think there's value in civic engagement and volunteering at the local level. Because at the end of the day, influencers posting about Black Lives Matter or climate crisis doesn't actually make people want to do something about it. It creates awareness.
Really feel something.
Yeah, it creates awareness, but it doesn't make you feel like, oh my God, I need to do something about this.
Right.
And because it also creates this perception that people are doing something about it. And so you don't really need to play a role.
Yeah, it turns civic engagement into a spectator sport.
Exactly.
Yeah,
if anything, this conversation has completely shown me that there is so much power in different perspectives, in different people, cultures, histories, industries. There's so much power in that. And there's even more power when they come together, because when they come together, that's where you find the area of growth and you find the mirror that's showing all of your ignorances. So this topic is so interesting because you have to weave everything in together. So it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter if you're brown or white or black or where you are in the world. This is a collective problem that's facing us. And at the very least, tell people about this episode, because that's how awareness is going to be raised.
I think the other thing that we can't forget is how much we can learn from nature.
Oh, there you go.
There's a field called biomimicry, which is, mimicking nature. And so there are already so many solutions that nature has. Well, think about it. Nature didn't need technology, right? If anything, technology destroyed a lot of nature. And so if you think about regenerative agriculture or any of these kinds of natural solutions, they're win-win-wins. It's not zero sum. Nature is not zero sum. And so if we have more organic produce, it's better for the soil, it's better for the earth, it's better for people, right? If you don't use pesticides and synthetic pesticides and antibiotics, it's better for the animals, and guess what? For the people who eat them too. And so it's really not rocket science if you think about it. And then, technology also can learn from biomimicry, because the Japanese bullet train was designed off of the kingfisher, which is a bird that can land in water without making a splash. And so this birder saw this bird and was like, oh, we should use this design this idea to design the Japanese bullet train. And so this is, one example of how we can learn from nature without reinventing the wheel.
That's super cool.
Yeah, so it's about being humble and open-minded and being, ready to learn from anybody, including nature. I mean, humans are one of the youngest species, if you think about it.
It's
so
true.
We shouldn't think that we know better than plants and trees and nature.
Absolutely. And the systems in ourselves are hundreds of millions of years old, to your point earlier about us being of nature. Maybe the best thing we have going for us right now is that we are still of nature,
Yeah, exactly. Think about pregnancy and giving birth. You don't do anything. You don't cognitively think about, the baby needs to be doing this or that. It just happens, right?
Right.
it's miraculous. And so there's just so much that we can just learn from what's going on in our bodies. And I think, that's what Eastern medicine and Western medicine is another interesting component of this too, which I think is a perfect reflection of the different ways of thinking about nature and how we think about our bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One being more of a silver bullet approach and the other being more holistic.
Yeah, and thinking about food as medicine, and it's more preventive versus something that is like cutting you open or taking drugs after the fact.
Yeah.
And so I think in sustainability, you do need both approaches.
My ask to anyone who's listening to this, who's thinking about designing the future, is to make sure you program the AI, the machine learning, and the robots to incorporate some form of sustainability and realize that, those are important decisions.
Yeah, I think we need to design things so that, things are not non-destructible, right?
Exactly.
Because we need to think about, if the earth is always changing, the climate's always changing, things are always changing, then the assumption should be, okay, how do we make sure that this is modular and easy to break down? I mean, there's now a right to repair movement in the tech industry where consumers are demanding, like, for example, their smartphones to be easier to fix versus having to toss the whole thing and buying a new one.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's that idea in design and architecture too, this mindset of thinking, how do I design this so it's, not going to be here 500 years later if we don't think it's a good thing anymore.
Right. Right. Yeah. Rigidity is toxic, both at a civilization level and just in natural sciences. Everything that succeeded is adapted.
I have not mentioned the name of your book yet, and that's because it's a work in progress. What's your timeline of when you think it's going to be finished and released so that we can be anticipating it?
Yeah, so still working on it. Title is TBD. Title's always hard. So if you have any ideas, or if your listeners have any ideas, that'd be awesome. I would love to hear them. But hoping sometime in Q1 or Q2 next year.
Nice. That's great. Nice. Yeah, well, we'll definitely be reading it, and I'm sure our listeners will be as well. And hopefully some important people out there that are maybe sitting in Washington, D.C. right now will be reading it as well. I'm sure they would get a lot out of it, and we would get a lot out of them reading it for sure.
That's my hope. That's why it has to be a collaboration.
Yep, absolutely. With language that everyone understands and can easily share with their local jurisdictions as well. I think that's the other thing, right? This thing is so complicated that if you can't easily tell it to someone else, there's no way that they're easily going to be able to tell it to anyone else. So for me personally, right, my responsibility would be to take what I learned from this episode, distill it in a way that I could easily tell another person about it so that that person can tell another person about it. So that's my biggest takeaway, or the project that I want to work on as a result of this conversation.
Yeah, I think storytelling is such an important part of this. And that's why, I really got into this because I watched so many documentaries and I was just struck by the stories, the personal stories. And so, data and information are important, but they only go so far. You need to complement it with stories.
Exactly. And then, so that person that's living on a plastic, field in Vietnam feels what I'm feeling, and I can feel what they're feeling. That's eventually what the goal of this entire thing is, to connect the humans on this planet.
Yes. Yeah. Awesome. That's why it can't just be numbers.
Exactly.
Can't be just numbers.
So let's end this episode with one final question. This is something that we're doing new here on the show, but it's one final question. The question is, what do you think is a modern masterpiece?
Wow. That's a really tough question. I still think it's our ability to connect with other people. I don't think it's just one building or architecture or technology, but it's really still like we are so resilient. The pandemic has been so difficult, but we still, I think, generate so much of our energy and happiness from connections. And I'm hoping that's really, going to help us get through these tough times and hopefully build a better future.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. Excellent.
I passed.
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can sign up for the Rising Weekly newsletter sent out each week.
Every Friday, we expand on the episode with insights, recommendations, and more.
You can sign up at risinglaterally.com.
Thank you.